Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
The topic of our conversation this time, Mike, is the darkest hour. Which hour does that relate to?
We're going to be looking in this episode, David, at that hour that Jesus had spoken about all the way through John's Gospel, the hour he was heading towards, that moment of his death, his cruel crucifixion at the hands of the Romans.
Last time we spoke, we were talking about the Passover meal, hours before the crucifixion. What happened between then and the crucifixion itself?
Yeah, that very special meal that Jesus reinterpreted, putting himself now at the center of Israel's history rather than the Passover event all those hundreds of years before. Well, what happened is that after the meal that they've shared together, Judas slips out in the middle of it to go and betray him to the Romans as he's planned to do. Jesus leaves with his disciples and goes to a familiar place for them, the Garden of Gethsemane. It seemed to be placed just on the other side of the Kidron Valley, just outside of Jerusalem's walls, that he used to like to go and get some peace and quiet there. And he goes there and prays, asks his disciples to stay awake with him and watch with him while he prays, but keeps coming back and finding them constantly falling asleep. It's while they're there in the garden as he's praying, preparing his heart for what is to come, crying out to God, Father, if it be possible, take this cup away from me, yet nevertheless, not what I want, but what you want. So he knew the pain. He was really clear. This was no thing that was going to be sprung on him unexpectedly at the last minute. He knew what was coming and was saying, God, if there's any other way, any other plan B, now would be a good moment, Lord, to bring it. But nevertheless, I'll do what you have planned for me, Father. It's there in the garden that he's arrested by soldiers and representatives of the chief priests. He's taken away to go through not just a trial, but a whole series of, parodies of trials, really. If you add up all the different ones, he probably went through 7 different trials that night before Caiaphas, before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, before Pilate, before Herod, passed backwards and forwards from one place to another, all during the night hours, which of course was forbidden in Jewish law. You were not supposed to try someone during hours of darkness. Why? Because it had to be at a time when all witnesses, all interested people could come and gather. So the Jewish religious leaders themselves are breaking their own law because they're so desperate to get rid of this man. So betrayed, praying in the garden, arrested, mockery of trials during the night, eventually committed to crucifixion. Why? Because Pilate was a coward. The Gospels make clear that he knew really well that Jesus was innocent and that he was being set up by the religious leaders. But they corner him. They say to him, if you don't have this man crucified, you're no friend of Caesar's. That was a clear threat. If you don't do what we're asking you to, then Caesar will hear about this. Why did that matter? Well, because Pilate's track record wasn't very good. He'd actually been posted to Jerusalem because he'd made a real mess of the posting he'd had before. So he was probably on his last chance, and he knew that. And so he agrees, he hands Jesus over to his soldiers to be flogged and then to be taken away for this cruel moment that we're looking at together.
Who should take the blame for the crucifixion of Jesus?
Do you know what? I think we could answer that at a whole number of different levels. At a purely human level, you could say, the Romans did it. And they did. It was Roman soldiers who banged the nails into his hands. And yet it's interesting that the Gospels almost seem to go out their way to show that they weren't the real culprits. In fact, Romans come out even quite well at times in both the Gospel accounts and in the book of Acts. Was it, therefore, not the Jews as a whole people by any means, but these religious leaders based in Jerusalem who had their vested interests, the high priest and his cohorts, the Sadducees, who had the real religious power? They were the ones who controlled the temple and what happened there. And the Sadducees certainly didn't want to lose their power. And this man always seemed to be undermining the temple. And then the Pharisees, because he always seemed to be undermining the law, or at least their interpretation of it. So certainly the religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders, have a huge amount of responsibility here. It was them who manipulated things, who manipulated evidence. They couldn't even get two witnesses as required by Jewish law to agree on a charge against him. So eventually they have to form trumped up charges and this sort of blackmail and threat of Pontius Pilate, the governor, to get him to do their dirty work for them. So I think undoubtedly in the Gospels, it is the Jewish religious leaders who are bringing their conspiracies together. Pharisees and Sadducees actually never really got on well at all, but they come together for the purpose of getting rid of Jesus. But you know, there's also another answer that comes out in the Bible. Who was responsible for the death of Jesus? Well, you, David, and me, and every other human being that's ever lived, because the New Testament makes clear that it was because of our sin that he went to the cross. It was our sin that he was paying the price for. God himself paying the price that we could not pay. So we can answer your question at a whole number of different levels, one of which at least comes down to including you and me.
This whole series of conversations is called Bible Surprises. How much of a surprise is the death of Jesus?
I don't think we can underestimate the surprise that this was. Of course, you know, we know the end of the story. And so we read the story in light of what we know is going to happen. And, you know, we hurry through what we call the Good Friday story, because we know Easter's coming, Sunday's coming. And so we read it in light of that. But for his followers, this must have been an enormous surprise, a huge, gut-wrenching shock for them. Over the past 3 years, since the first day he started to call them, calling those fishermen to abandon their nets and follow him, they slowly gathered, formed that group of 12 around him, had listened to his teaching, had seen his miracles. With growing understanding, had started to grasp who he was. And it was with growing understanding. But they'd eventually come to the point of understanding that this guy was indeed the promised Messiah. There's a lovely turning point in Matthew's Gospel when Jesus turns to his disciples at Caesarea Philippi, a well-known place for shrines to pagan gods, many gods, different gods. And there, in the context of this multi-god setting, Jesus turns to them and says, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And they reply, "Well, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, some say Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And then he turns to them and says, "Yeah, but what about you? Who do you say that I am?" And for the first time, clearly there, Peter says, "You are the Christ," which is the Greek word for the Hebrew Messiah. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of John, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven," and makes fantastic promises to him at that point. So they had grasped with increasing confidence that this man was indeed the promised Messiah. And suddenly, This man who was Messiah had been nailed to a cross, death by torture. Now, why was it such a surprise? Not just that their mate and buddy had got killed. You know, you might have said, well, we could have seen that coming. This was the way things were going. It was because of the popular Jewish expectation of what Messiah would be and do in those days. Everyone expected that Messiah would be a military, a political deliverer. He would be the one that God sent and anointed to raise an army who would clear the land of God's enemies and be the means of God bringing his kingdom here on earth. It was a Messiah with a sword, one who would lead an army into victorious battle. And what were they now seeing? They were seeing the one whom they believed would lead them into victory, would lead them into this fantastic victory over Rome and cleanse this land of these infidels, being now nailed to a cross by those very infidels. Their whole understanding of who Jesus was, their whole understanding of Messiahship at that point must have completely fallen apart. You know, to say it was a surprise is too small a word. It was a gut-wrenching shock for them at that moment.
Having said it was such a surprise, hadn't there been lots of clues in all that have been written and said in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. The thing is, it's always easier with hindsight, isn't it, David? We know that in everyday life. Oh, I see, is perhaps one of our much used expressions in life. But you're absolutely right. There had been a foretelling of this where, well, clearly in some of the prophets in the Old Testament. For example, Isaiah has a number of what we call the servant songs, and in his fourth servant song, Isaiah 53, it prophesies the suffering servant, the suffering Messiah, in such incredible detail. You'd almost think it had been written after the event, except it was written 700 years before. So the prophets themselves had not a detailed picture, but glimpses, windows, flashes of what was going to happen and of how when God's Messiah came, when God's servant came, it would be through suffering that he would restore his people. But we see it as well, even in the Gospels. With increasing clarity, Jesus had spoken about this being his destiny. Now, it starts, if you just take Matthew's Gospel, for example, it starts with just little hints, enigmatic comments. He talks to them on one occasion about how Jonah was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days, so the Son of Man will be in the earth for 3 days. Now, it's probably only with hindsight you get that. Oh, I see. Yeah. Just as Jonah was in the fish 3 days and God brought him back, so you, Jesus, were in the earth 3 days and God brought you back. But then Jesus builds up, telling them more and more. And one of the clearest places where he specifies what's going to happen is just after that incident where Peter had declared, "You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus said how blessed he was. And in Matthew 16, verse 21, we read these words. From that time on, when? From the time that Peter started to see he was indeed the promised Messiah. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples, now listen to the detail here, that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests and teachers of the law, that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter, of course, doesn't understand, takes him aside and says, "Lord, no, none of this is going to happen to you. I've just said you're Messiah. You've just said this. No, you've got it wrong, Lord." And Jesus, of course, says those powerful words, "Get behind me, Satan. You've not got in mind the plans of God, but the plans of men." So, yes, the prophets had spoken about this. Yes, Jesus, with increasing clarity through the gospel, had spoken about this. Yeah, it's always easy with hindsight, isn't it, to say, blow me. That's what he was saying, wasn't it? And I think it's because their mindset was so fixed about what Messiah would be and do. He would be God's conquering hero on the earth. And they were so fixed that that was how it had to be. That was their worldview, that they couldn't conceive of it being any other way.
How precise are some of those prophecies? How much detail is there?
Incredible detail, David, as we look back to some of the Old Testament. There's an interesting passage in Acts 2 where Peter is preaching his first sermon on the day of Pentecost, and where he says that Jesus was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. This wasn't a good plan that went pear-shaped. This was something that God had planned. So, here's just a few examples of dozens that there are. In Zechariah 11, there's a prophecy that Messiah would be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, just as he was, of course, with Judas. In Numbers 21, which is picked up by Jesus in John chapter 3, there's a prophecy that he would be lifted up on a pole, just as that serpent was in the wilderness that we looked at in a previous episode. A pole was often used symbolically of a place of execution. Psalm 22, wow, that's an amazing psalm. We read in that psalm that his bones would be put out of joint, his hands and feet would be pierced, his clothes would be divided up and gambled over. He'd be scorned by the crowd that surrounded him. He'd even cry out, that psalm says, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Psalm 33, it says that he would cry out, into your hands I commit my spirit. And that servant song that I spoke about in Isaiah 53 has incredible detail about the what and the why, including how he would be pierced, which of course happened when the soldiers thrust a spear into Jesus's side to ensure he was dead, and how he would be buried in a rich man's grave. So I'll tell you what, if Jesus was going to say, I am going to engineer my death, by the way, plus what happens after my death, the burial, in such a way as to fulfill all these prophecies, to make it look like I am that one, the chances of doing that would be better than the proverbial monkey at a keyboard typing out the Encyclopedia Britannica.
And one of those natural phenomena was the darkness that came over the land at the point Jesus died.
An incredible moment there when, at the very moment of Jesus' death, as his work is accomplished, as he cries out in John, it is finished. And by the way, that phrase in the Greek does not mean, oh no, it's finished, it's all gone wrong. The word that's used there is a word from the world of commerce, tetelestai, all paid for. It's the equivalent of like if you go and pay a bill these days and they stamp it saying paid and put their signature. Tetelestai was what they wrote on a document, all paid for. What's all paid for? All the sin of the whole world paid for. And at that moment, John says, Jesus gives up his spirit, and the Gospels record how at that moment, creation itself responds to the Lord of creation, the master of creation, giving up his life for us, and the whole of creation cries out. Darkness covers the land leading up to that moment. At the moment he dies, it says that even some of the godly dead come out of their tombs. Jesus had done that during his life. He now does it at the point of his death. So here is the whole of creation recognizing the enormity of what is about to happen.
And as you said, it's easier in retrospect to appreciate what had happened, but the reality of it begins to emerge.
It's interesting, the Gospels are very circumspect about describing what happened to Jesus that day.
They don't go into much detail?
Not at all. There are some Christian traditions that make a lot of the passion, the suffering of Jesus, but Matthew, Mark and Luke, the three synoptic Gospels, simply say, and they crucified him. John, in his account, simply says, and he gave up his spirit. Interesting. He takes it back on himself. It's not they killed him, it's he gave up his life. God in control.
So no gory details?
No gory details at all, and yet we know of the gory details. Crucifixion was a horrible and cruel death. It was execution by torture. We think it was invented by the Phoenicians, and the Romans adopted it because they found it as a particularly cruel way of really warning people to keep in their place. So what would happen is that the person being crucified would be stripped naked, first of all. They would then be flogged with those lashes that had little bits of either flint or iron in them, so it ripped open the flesh. The culprit would then have to often carry his crossbar to the place of execution, just like Jesus himself did. We read in the accounts, the crossbar is laid on the floor. The victim is then laid on it. The Romans would then take huge iron stakes, not just tiny little nails. They'd be like 6-9 inch long metal spikes that they would nail the victim to the crossbars. By the way, they went not through the palm of the hands. Often Christian art has Jesus shown with his palms with a wound in them. They did that. Hands would rip out immediately he was lifted up. It actually went through the wrist, between the two wrist bones, so that there was something to hold on to. So the agony of those spikes going through your two hands. Then that crossbeam would have a rope wrapped around it and would be hoisted up onto a pole that was already there in place. Normally they were kept in place so they could just be slotted down onto it. Imagine the pain as you're just hanging with your two wrists there from the cross. And then they come and take your feet, turn your legs sideways, sort of push your legs up slightly so you're in a sort of semi-seated position sideways, except there's nothing to sit on. Then drive another spike through your heel bones. Now you're in excruciating pain as you are hanging there. Not only is there the pain of the muscles ripped away, the blood pouring away, you're now being pulled on the weight of your two wrists. So what do you want to do? You want to push yourself up so that you can get a breath because it's pulling on your lungs. So you push on your feet and try and just push up so you can grab a breath, but that's excruciatingly painful. So you grab a breath and let yourself go again. And this is what would often happen for hours. Actually, victims could remain conscious for days, suffering this torture as life slowly slipped away from them. And normally, eventually, the body would be left there once it was dead for the birds, the carrion, then to eat it and take it away. This was a horrible experience. The disciples would be watching from a distance. We know, actually, it was the women, the good old women followers who were the bold ones who stood there. What pain for Mary, the mother of Jesus, as she stood there. What care from Jesus, as one of his last words is to John to say, here's your mother. In other words, take care of her for me. What tenderness at that moment. So I think what would be going on and what the disciples would be experiencing at this point until he actually cries out that it's finished and breathes his last, all within 3 hours. That was really unusual. They normally took much longer than that to die. But what was going on here, I think for Jesus, it was not just the physical pain. There was spiritual and emotional pain as he was carrying the sins of the world in his body, giving himself as the sacrifice for us.
Because you said in a previous conversation that Jesus was a human, fully human, but without sin. So he didn't deserve to die this death.
Absolutely not. He said during his life, which one of you can accuse me of sin? And no one had been able to bring up a charge. Remember, the Jewish leaders had to trump up charges because they couldn't find two witnesses to agree on any one thing that he'd ever said wrong. So he really did die as a sinless man, having faultlessly kept God's law and shown God's love. And yet he was a real man, so he went through the real pain and the real agony that the cross would cost him. But he was dying, the New Testament tells us, not for his sin, he had none, but for ours. And I suppose one of the biggest surprises that comes out of this whole thing is he knew this all along. He'd planned it all along. He knew that this was going to be the means of salvation. He'd said, John 3, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man will be lifted up, so that whoever believes in him wouldn't perish, but have eternal life. This is Jesus here, the sinless man, God become man, who lived a sinless life, offering his life to deal with our sin so that we might come back into friendship with God.
What was the response of those who actually saw Jesus die on the cross?
It's very interesting. There was a mixed response for the Jewish leaders, no doubt joy at last, that this guy who had been a pain in the butt for the last 3 years, they had got rid of. Quite interesting response from the Roman centurion, who was there in charge of the execution party. It's interesting, sometimes stories have been said, well, maybe Jesus never died on the cross. Well, I tell you, that is an impossibility. After all the suffering that this guy went through, and even more than that, the centurion in charge of the execution party was personally responsible to ensure the death of his victim. And actually, if he did not ensure his death, it was at the risk of his own life. So I tell you what, if I'd been the centurion in charge that day, I'd have made sure this guy was well and truly dead. But it's interesting, the guy in charge of that centurion, as darkness comes over the face of the land, as we spoke about a few minutes ago, and, as he looks at this man, and remember there's this sign above him that Pilate has put there and that he refused to remove, despite the objections of the Jewish leaders, that Jesus was the Son of God, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And as darkness covers the land, this centurion looks up and suddenly something clicks in his heart and he says, surely this man was the Son of God. Wow, he's a representative of those who crucified him, recognizing that this was no mere man dying on the cross. This was the Son of God who died for us.
And what can our reaction be to the crucifixion of Jesus?
Well, I suppose we can take it one of two ways. The reaction of some people is, it's all a fairy story. It's all made up. For others, it may be, well, yeah, I do believe that Jesus lived many years ago and he was a good man and a good prophet, and he ended up with this terribly disappointing end to his life, but I don't know if it makes any difference to me. Or we can make the response that comes out when we see his disciples on the third day, seeing Jesus now risen from the dead. Why was it so important he rose from the dead? Because that was what proved that God had accepted his sacrifice for us on the cross. Death could not hold him. Why? Because he had no sin. And the wages of sin is death. But Jesus was taking our death upon himself, the result of our sin upon himself. And as we come to the New Testament and as they look back on this moment and as they reflect on all of Jesus's teaching, they'll use a whole number of different pictures of what was happening when Jesus died on the cross for us. But I've got 8 words that are my little mantra that I use again and again. What happened? It's there at the cross that we were made clean, bought back, put right, made friends, made clean, the picture of Jesus dying as our sacrifice, bought back, the picture of Jesus as our ransom, paying the price to set us free, put right, the picture of Jesus dying as the means of our justification, putting us right in a right relationship with God, made friends, reconciliation, the means through which God restored friendship between us and him, made clean, bought back, put right, made friends. That's the discovery that the New Testament would have us draw from this. All of them things that Jesus had taught during his life, but all of which become so much more clear in the light of the resurrection.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.